Welcome to the Autonomic Healing Podcast. I'm Tom Pells.
And I'm Ruth Lawrenson. We'll be unpacking what it looks like to activate your brain to holistically manage stress and trauma that bring healing to the mind, body, and spirit.
Being free to live authentically as humans.
Thank you for joining us. Let's get this conversation started.
So we're here on the Autonomic Healing Podcast, and this is a really special episode for us, Tom, because we have a guest that I know he's someone who's been incredibly influential to you. We've got Scott Turner with us today, and we're so excited to have you, Scott. Thank you so much for your time. And you are someone who is one of the leading voices on homeostasis. You're an author. Your last book in 2017, I think, was Purpose and Desire. And so we're really excited to have your voice in this space. Obviously, you know, what you end up doing in your profession is very different to what we do with autonomic healing. But we just really feel like your insight, your knowledge, the area of study that you've been diving into all of these years will be of huge benefit to us and our listeners. So thank you so much for coming. We are stoked that you're here.
Thank you for having me.
So, Tom, I know like you've been Scott has actually really influenced you as you've been developing autonomic healing. You know, massive piece of your discovery has been Scott's work on homeostasis. So I'm going to throw this over to you to start us off to have a conversation with Scott about some of the things that you feel are brewing in this space of homeostasis.
Yes, thank you. And thank you, Scott. The subject of homeostasis has been endlessly fascinating to me for many, many years and was instrumental in my developing Autonomic Healing Activation, whose I originally titled Autonomic Homeostasis Activation. I just ran into so many people who said, what? With homeostasis. So I just changed it to healing. And because that's the effect of homeostasis. So it's the subtitle of the book, Purpose and Desire. What makes something alive? And that's homeostasis. And would love to hear your thoughts on sort of the history of homeostasis in summary fashion, and some of the essential understandings of what homeostasis is as we've understood it.
Well, thanks, Tom and Ruth, for having me on. I often describe homeostasis as probably one of the most trivialized and misunderstood concepts in modern biology. And this was not always my position. I came to this through some rather odd studies on termites, of all things, Southern African termites. And I'm sure we'll get into that a little bit. But homeostasis, if you read most physiology textbooks, it's usually defined as a mechanism, a regulatory mechanism. And the classic example of that, of course, is body temperature regulation of humans. And the dominant way of thinking about homeostasis has been as a mechanism, specifically a cybernetic mechanism, like the kind of mechanism you have in your house thermostat, for example. So you have a set point, you have sensors of temperature, you compare the sense temperature versus a set point temperature, and then this feeds back onto some machinery that either turns on the heater in your house or turns on the air conditioning, and what you end up with is a relatively steady house temperature. And of course, mammals have this kind of system. We regulate our body temperatures. It sometimes changes, as in the case of fever, for example, but nevertheless, we have a relatively steady body temperature. Now, this comes primarily from work that was done around World War II on the field of cybernetics, and this was thought to be the explanation for all homeostasis, and it was applied in all kinds of circumstances, including the system that I worked on, which is social physiology of termite colonies. And that's a very powerful tool, but there are a couple of things to point out about it. One is that it treats homeostasis as an outcome of a mechanism. So when you have a constant temperature in your house, for example, that's the outcome of the operation of this thermostat, this mechanism. And there was a lot of work done in the 1950s to try to find the elements of that in the mammal, human temperature regulating system. And so there's that whole thing, that is, homeostasis follows from a mechanism. And the other important thing about it is that it's the more you delve into this mechanism, the less well it explains the phenomenon that you're looking at. And so the arc, for example, of body temperature regulation in mammals started off with a fairly simple system, sort of explained it, but there were anomalies. So to correct the anomalies, you add another system in there. So for example, it started off with there just being a brain thermostat. And then you find out, well, it doesn't quite work that way. So you add a spinal cord thermostat, and then these kinds of things proliferate and proliferate, each one trying to explain an anomaly. And you end up at the point where you can't actually point to a thermostat anymore. Every cell in the body is somehow participating in the regulation of body temperature, and of course, that points to homeostasis maybe being something other than the outcome of a pre-existing mechanism. Now, if you could just segue into the work that I was doing on termite colonies. In the 1960s, this cybernetic mechanism was applied to a phenomenon that people called social homeostasis, applying specifically to social insects. And so in a bee colony, for example, you have a number of individuals in there. They're all independent organisms moving around. They all have different things that they do in the colony. And if you measure the temperature of a hive, a beehive, for example, you find that they actually also kind of maintain a steady temperature of the hive. And so this behavior of temperature was posited to come from the social interactions of all the different bees, and that's where the term social homeostasis comes from. Now, in the case of the termites, there was a very, very famous paper that was published in the 1960s. It was called The Air-Conditioned Termite Nest, and this was very, very famous. And it was a paper that applied this social homeostasis idea to termite colonies, and a particular kind of termite colony, not the kind that live in your house and eat it up from within, but these colonies, they build immense mounds. They're Southern African termites. They live in the savannas of that region, and they build these enormous mounds. They don't actually live in the mounds. The nest for the termites is actually underground, but this mound is this incredible network of tunnels and a porous surface and so forth. And there was this idea that, oh, well, the termite colony produces heat that makes air rise within the mound, and that sets up a kind of a circulation of air within the mound. And if the colony was too hot, that would make the air circulate faster and therefore get rid of heat faster and all these sorts of things. And so it's not, well, this is a lovely self-regulating mechanism. And it was all, again, the outcome of the interaction of the colony's metabolism, metabolic heat production, with the structure that these termites built. Now, I lived for several years in southern Africa and sort of stumbled across these and found them fascinating. I was a physiologist, and so I was quite familiar with this air-conditioned termite nest idea because it was a famous example, a beautiful picture. And the last year I was there, I was teaching in a small college where there were a lot of these termites. And so I decided I would show my students how air moved within these mounds because it was so well established. It had to be there. I didn't even have to test it. And what I found basically was that I could find no evidence of the airflows that everyone said had to be there. There were airflows, but not in the patterns that this very famous model suggested, and that set me off on a long journey. You know, I wondered, well, why aren't I seeing this? You know, you have to, of course, test your instruments first to make sure that they're not lying to you. That took a few years. And then eventually you piece all these things together. And after about a decade or so of going back there once a year to do various kinds of tests, we gradually pieced together the way that the termite colony actually works. And where that finally led us was to some rather different ideas of social homeostasis in these termite colonies. And from there, some rather different ideas of homeostasis in general, coming back to the topic you started off with, Tom. And the weirdest thing about where I was being led intellectually was that homeostasis really wasn't the outcome of a mechanism. It was actually just the reverse. That is, the mechanism is the outcome of homeostasis. And how you get to that is, well, really the only way you can get to that is to think about homeostasis not as just this mechanism. Then we have to figure out how the mechanisms work and so forth. It really boils down to homeostasis being a fundamental property of life. And when you think about how the organism or the social organism, if you will, in the case of bees and termite colonies, everything about it streams from this fundamental property of homeostasis. For example, to give you an example from the termite colonies, if you look at the architecture of these mounds, for example, it's variable. It's a very dynamic structure. About a quarter of a ton of soil cycles through these things every year. Rain and wind erode soil away, and then the termites get busy transporting soil up to help replace the lost soil. And so even though it looks very solid, it's dynamic. It's a balance between termite deposition and physical erosion. And it can be varied. So, for example, we would take the top of these mounds and turn them around, for example. They typically point towards the north. And after about a year or so, well, first of all, the termites would come heal this insult that we did to their mounds, take the top of their mound and turn it around. And after about a year or so, you would see that they were building it back to tilting in the original direction. And so, but this dynamism comes in natural form. So, for example, if there's a tree on one side shading the mound, you'll have a different structure compared to when there's a tree on the other side, for example, or when there's no tree at all. And so this is an adaptable structure, and it comes about by termites building a structure that for some reason is comfortable to them. In other words, the kind of homeostasis, if you will, that exists within the termite mounds is actually extended. And so this is an example of how function and structure can stream from homeostasis rather than the typical way that we look at it, which is homeostasis streaming from mechanism. There's a lot in there. I'm sure that we're going to have some questions about that, but I'll just turn that back to you now.
Yeah. From my perspective, from the therapist side, not the science side, approaching homeostasis, the analogy is to the human body as an organism, and it is analogous, I think. It's an ecosystem. We exist that way. And as a matter of fact, one of the things that you'd shared, which I found absolutely fascinating, is that there are lots of things living within us that are not us. And that's part of our ecosystem and part of our homeostasis and experience.
Okay, can you just explain that? There's other things living in us that aren't us. Explain that a bit more.
Would you take that one, Scott?
Sure. We consist of a number of cells descended from a fertilized egg, a single parent, if you will. But our bodies are not just those cells. We harbor an incredible ecosystem of microbes. These exist not only within our intestines. That's a quite well-known phenomenon. Although, if you think about it topologically, the interior of our digestive tract, for example, is actually outside the body. It's we're like this donut with a very complicated twisted hole that runs from one end to the other. So our digestive system hosts an incredible microbial ecosystem that is crucial to not only our ability to digest, but also to develop a gut that can effectively digest food. So, for example, there were some very famous experiments a few years ago where rat pups were born by cesarean section, basically. And what that does is it deprives those rat pups of the microbial the microbial community of their mother, which is actually imparted to the rat pups at birth. And these poor rat pups, they developed all kinds of gut malformations, all kinds of food sensitivities, very severe food sensitivities. And the most interesting thing about this was that when you inoculated those rat pups with the microbial ecosystem of the mother, they healed. They developed a properly structured gut. They were able to avoid, or they were able to heal their food intolerances and these kinds of things. And in addition to what goes on in our gut, the entire surface of our body houses different microbial communities. So, for example, there's a well-known microbial community that exists in our mouths. And this, of course, is one of the things that leads to dental caries, cavities in the teeth. When you have a cavity, it's not from eating sugar or those kinds of things. It's actually doing things that can promote the growth of a bacterium that actually eats into the enamel of the teeth. That's its food. The nose has a different microbial community from the ear, from the structures in the groin, for example. And so if you add up the actual number of cells that comprise our bodies, for example, the microbial community is several multiples of the number of cells that are descended from the fertilized egg that come from our mother and father. And this is a very dynamic community. Excuse me, as we know, the microbial community can be changed by diet. It can be changed by disease or those kinds of things, and that can lead to all kinds of issues, including, for example, obesity. Obesity is probably a microbial disease, and when we talk about the obesity epidemic, for example, you're probably really talking about an epidemic, which is the spread of a particular maladaptive colony of bacteria in our guts, spread from person to person. And so, we're a very complicated ecosystem. And just to fill in another phrase that you used, Tom, you mentioned many little lives.
Mm-hmm.
That's actually one of the founding principles of the modern idea of homeostasis. And interestingly enough, it was formulated by a French physiologist. His name was Théophile Bourdieu, and he noticed that bee colonies, bee swarms, behaved a lot like organisms did. And so he proposed that, well, this actually is a kind of a super organism. And he developed that into a whole theory of what he called the many little lives. And at the time, there was a lot of dispute about just what is it that makes up an organism, that makes up a coherent body of life that acts autonomously, that has persistence, all those kinds of things. And at the time, it was thought that there were these vital fluids that were circulating through the nerves that could organize things and that imparted life to what otherwise would be inanimate matter. And you had the same kind of problem going on there that you had with the temperature regulating thing that I mentioned before. So for example, you would have a vital fluid, and that would explain something, and then there'd be an anomaly, and then someone would have to invent another vital fluid, and eventually you ended up with this huge proliferation of vital fluids that was not telling anybody about anything about how organisms worked. And so Bourdieu's way of going through this was that, well, it's not vital stuff or vital fluids that makes an organism, that imparts organism-like attributes to an organism. Rather, what it was a pattern of communication and mutual accommodation between what he called the many little lives of the organism. With our standard conception of the organism as being a group of cells that descends from the fertilized egg from our parents, what is important there is really that the organism consists of these many little lives, cells basically, and what makes an organism with all its attributes is not some vital stuff, but rather an ongoing negotiation, if you will, between all the many little lives and mutual accommodation of those many little lives to produce this steadiness of, or this persistence, if you will, of an organism. We all are persistent in time. You look the same, Tom, as you did the couple of days that I saw you last, and you look pretty much the same in a year from now. But you will be composed of an entirely different set of atoms and molecules, because what you are is you're actually a conduit for the flow of matter and energy with continual turnover going on inside. And the beauty of the many little lives idea is that it doesn't have to stop at the skin. It can include, for example, the microbial communities that we spoke about, and it can include, for example, taking the termite colony again. The mound that these things construct is actually an extension of the many little lives of the termite colony. And this leads into another kind of crucial idea, the extended organism idea, which is that if you have homeostasis within our bodies, for example, or within the bodies of 2 million termites comprising a colony, for example, those organisms construct environments. And so within our own bodies, for example, you have not only cells, but the cells organized into sheets of tissues. There's one lining our lungs, for example. There's another lining our intestines and those kinds of things. Those are called tissues. And of course, tissues organize into organs and organ systems. So you have this kind of hierarchy of organization going on in there. But the homeostasis in there is manifest in an ongoing negotiation between all the different many little lives. And so, for example, the lung tissue, for example, will negotiate with the heart tissue, and the brain cells will negotiate with everything else in the body. This is where your autonomic nervous system and the peripheral nervous system start to come in. And in the case of the termite, and the outcome of that is a built organism contained within a skin, but it doesn't stop there. So, for example, if we're cold, what do? We build a house, or we build a shelter of some sort, and we build it in such a way that we can stay within a comfort zone. That's an example of an extended organism for humans. Or we build cities, or any of these other kinds of things. And in the case of the termites, of course, they restructure their environment in some radical ways. They take tons of soil and they mold it into this mound. They also modify the soil environment for tens of meters around the colony, sometimes to the point where they can modify the hydrology of an entire region. And so this notion that the activities of an organism don't just go on within our bodies; they also extend outwards. This is the prime example of homeostasis driving the outcome. In other words, the mechanisms that drive the outcome, and so that's kind of where we are. And so, and it all stems from the fact that again, you have homeostasis producing mechanism, not the other way around.
Yep.
Yeah.
And what all that leads to and involves is cognition. There is thinking going on. There is awareness going on. There is a processing of that information within and throughout the organism.
Absolutely.
And so it's this cognition. And with AHA, the cognition is that aspect of interoception, our awareness of this dynamic of homeostasis. And would you talk a little bit about that, please, Scott?
Sure. Yeah. You cannot have. Well, I mentioned that the mechanisms come downstream from homeostasis, and so we can parse those mechanisms out into a couple of essential aspects. So, for example, the homeostatic organism. The first thing it needs to do is to be able to be informed about what its environment is. You cannot have that without that. You have to have some way of being able to sense what the organism is, and that's one element of what is basically a cognitive system. All right. Then you have a means of being able to understand and interpret what's going on inside the organism. And I should introduce a concept here that I call the adaptive boundary. The cell membrane is the ultimate example of that. It's an adaptive boundary because it separates environments. You have an environment inside the cell that's separated from the outside by the cell membrane, or the adaptive boundary. And the adaptive boundary gathers information about what the environment is outside the boundary, and then inside the boundary there are mechanisms. Well, that information has to somehow be interpreted, and we can get down to the mechanistic details here. In the case of the cell, that will do things like change protein shape. It'll change the transcription of genes, and all those other kinds of things as well. And that's where a lot of work on how homeostasis works and how living things work tends to stop. But that's still not the whole set of components that you need for an adaptive system. So let's just go through them again. You have an outside environment. You have the adaptive boundary, sensing it, and all the changes inside the cell that I just mentioned that basically maps that information outside into some kind of cognitive map, if you will, or some kind of image of what's going on outside outside the cell. And then that cognitive map is coupled to the adaptive boundary again, but in this case, the work is done the other way. And so, and so, when you change the flows of matter and energy across a cell membrane, that's not something that happens just inside the cell. It happens on both sides of the cell. That's the essence of that comes from very simple principles of conservation of mass, and energy. And so what you have is a kind of loop, if you will. So outside environment, adaptive boundary, cognitive map. Cognitive map is coupled to the adaptive boundary again, which does work on the environment to modify it. And that's a property of all living things. I've described it in the context of the cell, but it can occur in the context of higher levels of organization, such as tissues, and even up to the structures built by termites, if you will. All right. And so that's the outcome of all those things happening is adaptation. So if the outside environment changes, that changes the cognitive map, and that changes the work that's done, and the living component, for example, is modified in response to that, so that it can persist. This is where the homeostasis comes in. And so you have not only modification of what's going on inside, but you also have modification of what's going on outside as well, active modification. And this leads to kind of an interesting conundrum in evolutionary biology and ecology. In evolution, for example, the standard idea is that living things adapt to changing environments. In other words, they're thrown into this environment and they either adapt or die. That's the whole idea behind natural selection. But if you extend this cognitive loop idea to evolutionary biology, you have a very interesting conundrum there. Not only do organisms adapt to environments, but organisms adapt environment to themselves. And this is universal, and this happens at every level of organization, which is where I think we come back into the therapeutic realm, which is something which is an area I am completely not familiar with. I'm not a therapist. I'm an ecologist and an evolutionary biologist. But you have this kind of adaptability operating at all levels of organization. We spent some detail on the cell, for example, but this happens across tissues. It happens on communication between different parts of the body. There's adaptation going on all the time. And so, for example, the simplest example is if you have a muscle and you're straining it beyond its capabilities, the environment is changed to make a stronger muscle. And when you're talking about, for example, the function inside the gut, all right, the gut lining is a major adaptive boundary. You have modifications of the gut, which operate in order to, basically you're adapting the environment to the components of the cells that are going into that. And of course, this extends to communication between different parts. And this is where I think that this autonomic healing idea can come in. Again, I have no expertise in any of this, but it's a plausible mechanism to me, just because of the way other things engage in adaptation. And just one final comment about that, which gets me in trouble quite a bit, is that what this points to is that cognition is not simply a consequence of complex nervous systems. Every living thing is cognitive, and furthermore, every living thing is intelligent in its way, and that makes it purposeful. And that makes all living things purposeful and intentional. And these are things that we tend not to. Well, scientists tend not to think in those ways. They tend to think in those very strict mechanistic ways. And introducing concepts like intelligence and intentionality and even creativity into this starts to really kind of push the envelope of what scientists are allowed to talk about.
Mm-hmm. And I'm right out there with you in the off the reservation.
Well, yes.
Yeah, but life just shows us that the evidence, what we observe, it just does that. So account for it or strictly adhere to dogma and say, nope, can't be. Well, then you run into, well, how do you explain it? And you can't. Except there are explanations.
Yeah, this is absolutely true. It's when I try to tell people about people who aren't scientists about what I'm saying about intentionality and purposefulness, they say, well, doesn't everybody know that? This doesn't seem very very striking, because the evidence is right there in front of you. Of course, the behavior of your dog is purposeful. The behavior of of an amoeba is purposeful. And all those kinds of things. And it's only in the peculiar philosophical world of modern science, which is reductionist and mechanistic and those kinds of things, where you're not allowed to bring in concepts like purposefulness and intentionality, that things start to get a little controversial. But as you say, look around and look at the world, and look at the living world, and you cannot escape that it's a fundamentally purposeful place. And it's so things.
Yep. So with interoception being our awareness at a sensory level of all of this cognition going on, all of this life persisting and restoring optimum normal function, the analogy of the aardvark destroying and disrupting the homeostasis of the termite colony, to me, that's striking and is analogous to our human experience of stress and trauma. The aardvarks attack us. They disrupt our homeostasis, and the brain's going, can I fix that? Can I restore that? And I'll get all these little things within us acting to restore normal function.
Yeah, I mean, the aardvark idea is or what aardvarks do. That's a disturbance to this system that is painstakingly constructed by the millions of termites that live inside these colonies. And one of the dramatic things that which you can easily see if you happen to be down in Namibia or South Africa, is that if you damage one of these mounds, that elicits a very rapid repair response. And again, this is, well, it took us a lot of time to figure out what actually was going on, between the injury and the repair, because one of the strange things about it is that if you drill a hole in a mound, for example, you're usually drilling into a structure that's a couple of meters away from the actual colony, and somehow the termites know to come to this particular spot to do the repair, and so not only do you have the damage to the mound, which I imagine, to draw an analogy, is analogous to the kinds of injuries that we do to ourselves, not just frank injuries like cutting yourself, for example, or having a broken bone or things like this, but all the things that go into managing that stress. And so when you talk about the damage to a termite mound, it's a colony-wide project to come in and repair this mound. And, it engages all the many little lives, if you will, of the termite colony. And if you translate to the human, we're also comprised of many little lives. Then one injury, for example, or one pathology is going to have these ramifying consequences that are going to influence things. And again, coming back to the termite mound, that's where my expertise lies. If you repeatedly injure a particular place on the termite mound, you will elicit a long-term change in the structure of that mound. And
wow.
And some of the things that we're describing, Tom, sound very much like that.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just thinking, Tom, of like just the, I'm obviously thinking through stress and trauma lens here, but as I'm listening to Scott and just the, obviously there's these things that can happen once off with stress and trauma, but what we've been talking about recently is just the ongoing, the kind of constant, the constant probing on our homeostasis from stress and trauma, right? And so if you think about that, compared to what Scott just mentioned of actually, if it's constant, it will change I can't remember what you said, Scott, but it will change the trajectory, or it will change the form eventually of that mound.
Yeah.
And I think that's what we're seeing, with the impact of stress and trauma. It's like, well, okay, it actually has an effect on our whole system and our whole life. It can do. So, sorry, I interrupted you, Scott. What were you going to say? Do you remember?
No, I was just going to mention that, yes, you can have these long-term changes in the structure of the termite mound, and I imagine the same thing can happen in bodies. But this is an interesting part of the conversation that Tom and I had a couple of days ago. When you're talking about these kinds of things, it's all homeostasis, and the system of the for lack of a better word, deranged system, which is what you get in the modified termite mound, and what I imagine you get from persistent response to stress, for example, that's also a regulated state. And the challenge is actually to change that regulated state from one place to another. And I think that's what your autonomic healing approach is, Tom.
You've been listening to the Autonomic Healing Podcast.
Join us next time as we continue in our conversations with Tom. If you're interested in pursuing your own autonomic healing journey and want to find a practitioner, visit our website, innerworkings.org. See you at the next episode.